Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation. My name is Colleen Fitzpatrick, and I'm the Community Relations and Events Manager here at CG. I'd like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the CG Signature Lecture Series. You'll find Wordsworth in our lobby after the lecture with Lawrence Hill's new book, The Illegal, for sale. Tonight's special event price for the book is $35, which includes tax. I'd also like to extend our thanks to our co-sponsors this evening, Wilfrid Laurier University and the University of Waterloo. They invite you to a community coffee reception and a book signing following this lecture in our grand foyer. To reduce wait times at the book signing table, we kindly ask that you hold off on photo taking until all the books have been signed. Thanks also to all of you for joining us this evening, whether you're here as part of our live audience or the many joining us through our live webcast this evening. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both audiences at the microphones here at CG or through the live chat function on your screen. Please remember to state your name and to keep your questions brief. Here to introduce tonight's speaker is Carol Duncan, Professor of Religion and Culture at Wilfrid Laurier University. Please join me in welcoming Carol.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to join you this evening in introducing Lawrence Hill, author, screenwriter, someone I'm proud to call friend as well, and somebody who I think exudes loving kindness for other human beings and portrays that in all of his works. I've been a faculty member at Laurier for 18 years, and this is probably my 8th event with Larry over the last 15 or so. We first met 22 years ago in Toronto at York University in an event connected with Larry's very first novel. Since then, I've had the opportunity to work with him on several different projects. With each visit to the Kitchener-Waterloo community, Larry has deepened his friendships and connections with us all, and we are all richer for these visits. He's the author of 10 books, including The Illegal, his latest novel, and the much-celebrated The Book of Negroes, winner of various awards, including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and CBC Radio's Canada Reads. He was the inaugural writer-in-residence at Laurier, holding this position in fall 2010. In fact, The Illegal was something that he was working on at the time, and so here in Waterloo we have that connection to that work as well. In October of that same year, Larry's contributions to literature were recognized with an honorary doctorate of letters at Laurier, and I know that he holds the same distinction at the University of Waterloo as well. He delivered the 2013 Massey Lectures based on his nonfiction book, Blood, The Stuff of Life. He co-wrote the adaptation for the 6-part television miniseries, The Book of Negroes. Most recently, he is the winner of the 2015 Governor General's History Award for Popular Media, known as the Pierre Berton Award. This award recognizes those who have brought Canadian history to a wider audience. Larry's novel and the televised miniseries based on it have brought attention to a previously little-known chapter of Canadian and American history. This year in January, Laurier hosted a memorable community screening of an episode of the miniseries, followed by an in-depth discussion with Larry and with director and co-writer Clement Virgo. His current novel, The Illegal, I won't say lots and lots, I don't want to ruin the surprise or the wonder of reading the work, but it reflects on the past, it's very much about the present moment around refugee crisis in the world, and also looks to the future with its setting. Larry's interest in these issues is not recent. He has had decades-long involvement as a volunteer with Crossroads International and with the Black Loyalist Heritage Society and Project Bookmark of Canada. This evening, his lecture is entitled The Illegal, a Meditation on Refugee Issues. Following this evening's lecture, there will be a book signing and reception. Copies of the novel will be available for purchase, as Colleen Fitzpatrick mentioned, through book vendor Wordsworth Books. Without further ado, please help me to welcome Lawrence Hill.
Thank you so much, Carol, for that warm welcome. I have been so many times invited by Carol Duncan and her wonderful colleagues at Wilfrid Laurier University to speak here and to meet students, and it's an honor each time to do so. I must say that the books that have stayed with me my whole life, the books that I remember verbatim, the books that just lifted me into another sphere of awareness, were generally the books that I was reading as a teenager or as a young adult. And when you read a book when you're 15 or 21 and it just shocks you and sends you into another stratosphere of awareness, it's a book that you'll carry with you forever. And so it's a great honor to think that from time to time, university students or younger, high school, junior high, are reading my works and ingesting them and hopefully being moved by them. So thank you so much for welcoming me here. And those thanks go to many people. Colleen Fitzpatrick and CG, thank you so much for hosting this event. Wilfrid Laurier University, including, of course, President Max Blau and Vice President Deb McClatchy, and the University of Waterloo. I so much appreciate all of your partnerships in making this happen today. Also, Wordsworth Books and HarperCollins. You know that writers are not born in vacuums. They don't become writers in a vacuum. You know, it takes a village not just to raise a child, but also to raise a writer. And it's a village of infrastructure, publishers, bookstore owners, universities, grade school teachers, parents, critics. We live in a country that's rich with literary infrastructure, and it's for that reason I think that Canadian writers are so beloved and known and read across this country and around the world. It's a great country to be a writer in. So thank you so much for welcoming me today. And I've had occasion to come to University of Waterloo and to Wilfrid Laurier University, and through One Book, One Community, and various communities here. So it's great to be back. And as Carol mentioned, I wrote part of The Illegal and also worked on the Book of Negroes in Lucinda House on campus at Wilfrid Laurier, and I'm looking forward to coming back. And I must say that since James Walker, Dr. James Walker is in the audience today, I must say that I could never have written the Book of Negroes. Talk about infrastructure and standing on people's shoulders. Never could have written that novel without the seminal historical research laid down in Jim's book, The Black Loyalist, which came out around 1977-78 for the first time. Still the definitive, most scholarly history documenting the story of the Black Loyalists as they moved from Africa to the 13 colonies and up to New York City during the war, and then over to Nova Scotia and then back to Africa. Jim's work introduced me to this story, which led me to dramatize it in the Book of Negroes. So truly, we all stand on each other's shoulders. So I'm deeply honored that you're here, and thank you so much. In the Book of Negroes, I think what I was looking to do the most was to give a face to a person who might otherwise seem faceless. And one of the tragedies of transatlantic slavery is it tends to hide or obscure the humanity of the people drawn into it. Often a so-called slave is a faceless person in chains, and we don't see their humanity in full dimensionality. And that's what I was really looking to dramatize and to bring to the page in the Book of Negroes. In this new novel, The Illegal, I guess I'm looking to do something similar. I'm looking to bring to life and bring to the page the story, just one story, one of millions. There are millions of stories, and this is only one, of the stateless, undocumented refugee. What might a life look like? What sort of struggles might a person have? How do you get your life going as a stateless or undocumented person hiding in a rich nation that doesn't want you? I'm very much interested in the horrible circumstances that lead people to have to flee for their lives and to seek safety and peace in another life in another land. But in this novel, I'm even more interested in what happens to that person's life when he or she arrives in this new rich land. How do you survive when you're not wanted, when you're unwelcome, when you're undocumented and stateless? There are millions of people in the world, millions in Canada and the United States and in all rich democracies of the world who are stateless and living without papers. It's hard enough, we all know, to get on with our own lives when we're registered citizens, to work, to have a home, to build our lives, to perhaps usher children, ours or those of other people, those children we teach, into the world. We all know how hard it is just to get our lives going, but when you're stateless and have no right to be in a place, of course the challenges are monumentally greater, and that's what I'm interested in the illegal. I'll come back to this in a minute, but I'll just quickly describe the geographical setting of the novel, and then I'll read a few excerpts from it and talk a bit more about refugee issues and how they came to me and how I came to formulate the novel. This is the first time I've chosen to write a novel or any book in a place that's entirely imaginary. Every other one of my 9 books has a very concrete and real socio-historical geographical setting. But this time I decided to imagine a world that doesn't exist, but hopefully, well, not quite so hopefully, that could. I don't really want this world to exist that I'm imagining, but it could. And it looks like we may be going there in many respects. So I came up with 2 countries, and I set this novel in 2 places. One of the poorest nations in the world, which is a tiny mountainous island called Zantorland in the Indian Ocean, a nation of black people who were formerly enslaved. And although it's an extremely poor country, it has the dubious distinction of producing the world's fastest marathoners. And in any given year, Zantorland, the marathoners might win the top 5 places in the Boston Marathon and sweep gold, silver, and bronze in the Olympic Games. So they're dominant. Running and marathoning is in the culture of the country. Kids grow up running and training at altitude, and we all know what kind of advantages that confers on a marathon if you're training and running at altitude from your childhood. Better oxygen processing, so better runners. And it's in the culture of the country. And the one thing that Keita Ali, my protagonist, aspires to do as a child growing up in relative peace in Zantorland is to become an elite athlete. This is his ticket to fame, to wealth, to being venerated. This is the one thing that a child can aspire to make him rich and famous in this very poor, destitute country of Zantorland. So Keita Ali aspires as a child to become a great marathoner, a true Olympian, a champion. And all hell breaks loose in this country. Genocide erupts, political violence, and he's no longer able to pursue those dreams. You know, marathoning, shooting for the Olympics, is a peacetime pursuit. You can hardly think about running for Olympic glory if somebody's trying to kill you and your family and your people. Keita has to flee his country, and he goes to the nearest rich nation that he can get to hide in. It's one of the richest nations in the world. It's called Freedom State. It's also in the Indian Ocean, sandwiched between Madagascar and Australia. It's about 3 hours by airplane north of Zantorland, or about a month by rickety fishing vessel, which is how many refugees are escaping Zantorland and coming into Freedom State. And just to add a note of nuance politically and historically, this part isn't really dramatized in the novel, but you pick it up and learn it as the novel unfolds. There's a history between these 2 countries. Freedom State took people from Zantorland and enslaved them and used these people to build the very rich nation that it has become. But when slavery was abolished by the British Empire, Freedom State being part of the British Empire, it booted out its black inhabitants, the descendants of slaves and people who were freed from being slaves, and kicked them out and sent them to Zantorland They didn't want to go to Xantoroland, but they were sent there, and Freedom State paid the Xantoroland government a certain amount per head to take these people back. And ever since then, ever since the abolition of slavery and the forceful removal of Xantorolanders and their descendants from Freedom State, people from Xantoroland have been coming back as refugees to Freedom State. So they have a long and complex history, these two countries. And as Xantoroland is now erupting in violence, a great many refugees are trying to get into Freedom State. And for those of you who follow European politics, as I sometimes do, a few years ago during the national elections in France, in the first round of the presidential elections, and I was in France for them, a far right-wing party that's devoted to basically getting rid of immigrants and refugees, the Le Front National, won 17% of the popular vote of France. 17%. That's a staggering amount of the national vote going to a party that's basically, I think, devoted to fomenting hatred against refugees and immigrants and getting them out of France. And so it's a party like that that's come to power in Freedom State. A party like Le Front National has campaigned on a plank to catch and deport all refugees and bulldoze their community of Africtown. In Freedom State, a rich nation primarily inhabited by white people of European descent, there's a booming, thriving, huge, poor shantytown called Africtown, which is based on the southern edge of the capital city of Clarkson. So it's into Africtown that so many refugees go hiding. It's into Africtown that Keita Ali, my protagonist, 24-year-old elite marathoner, goes hiding. And I'll just read now a few sections of the book, now that I've contextualized it a little bit for you. The year is 2018, and we're in Freedom State, and the novel is beginning, and Keita is in the middle of a marathon. Go home! The words came from the runner on Keita's left, white and surely from Freedom State, limp brown hair flopping as he ran, arms too high, choppy gait. Running was the smoothest dance in the world. Keita had been trained to picture his legs like wheels. He'd learned to strike with his feet soundlessly, transfer weight through the balls of his feet, roll off the toes and spend more time flying than earthbound. Anybody could run, but few with grace. This competitor ran as if his tires weren't inflated. The runner on his left said it again, go home. A rude man. He deserved to suffer. Keita bumped up the pace. Sooner or later, the obnoxious fellow would start to hurt. The name of the game was to inflict more pain than he felt. So Keita, a stranger in a strange land whose only transgression was to exist in a place where his presence was illegal, would use speed to break this man. Keita had studied a map of the Buttersby Marathon. It was an out-and-back route, 21.1 kilometers east along the Chelting Escarpment, a 180-degree turn, and 21.1 kilometers right back to the finish line. A few kilometers after the halfway turn, they would climb back up the marathon's one and only hill. It would curve, steepen, and keep rising for 2 kilometers. Challenging, for sure. But what were 2 kilometers uphill at sea level in Freedom State compared to the red hills of Xantoroland at altitude? They ran along a winding road bordered by the tallest pine trees Keita had ever seen. Here along the marathon route, massive branchless trunks reached many stories into the air and exploded into a riot of needles and cones. Keita inhaled the smell of pine. Odd to find such welcoming trees in this hostile land. Driving just ahead of them were 3 police motorcycles. One carried a race official who sat facing backwards to keep his eye on the leading marathoners. Keita tried to put the police officers out of his mind. They would never suspect him, not in a race, not under their noses. The motorcade rounded a corner. In the instant it slipped out of sight, the fellow to Keita's left threw a low punch. Keita saw the blow coming and stepped to the right, but it glanced off his umbilical hernia. The hernia, now the size of a golf ball, throbbed. Could the other runner tell it was there, under Keita's shirt? The runners rounded the corner, and the motorcycles came into sight again. It wouldn't be enough to beat his aggressor. Kata wanted to make him suffer. But the aggressive runner remained close. "Gonna mess you up," the man said. Kata drifted to the far side of the road. The runner stayed with him. Kata swerved back. The name-caller stuck to him. A string of orange cones marked the halfway point. The runners rounded the turn and began to run back in the direction from which they'd come. Kata glanced at the large digital clock, which showed 1 hour, 5 minutes, and 11 seconds. Kata's adversary tucked in behind him, and the third runner trailed by a step. Another white guy from Freedom State. 200 meters back in the direction of the finish line, they blew past the 4th and 5th place runners. 600 meters further along, they encountered another trickle of outbound runners. Kata glanced down. The hernia embarrassed him. When the television news in Freedom State wanted to show hungry kids in Zantoroland, they always zoomed in on a child with a hernia, a swollen belly, and faint, meager hair, reddish from malnutrition. Perhaps it was to blame for Kata's recent bouts of thirst. The hernia was small, but in the weeks since he'd gone into hiding in Freedom State, staying in black market guest houses that took in undocumented refugees at dusk and booted them out at dawn, he had often experienced an unquenchable thirst. Today, however, he had gulped down cups of electrolyte drink at each water station, and so far he felt strong. Today he hoped his body would not betray him. Kata had to make enough money to get the hernia fixed. Leaving aside money to keep himself fed, clothed, and well hidden, he would need thousands for the surgery. If he won another few races, he would check out a private clinic. But first, he had to win this race. The jerk remained one stride back. "Right on your ass, sonny boy," he said. He poked Kata's shoulder. "Roger Bannister," he sneered, referring to the name on Kata's bib. "Not on your life." Kata glanced back at his nemesis, a snarling face, mouth hanging open, and a race bib that said Billy Deeds. "What are you looking at?" Deeds asked him. Kata kept running. Deeds would expect to race up the hill, so the best strategy was to cause him pain before they got there. A kilometer before the hill, Kata picked up the pace and put on a burst for 100 meters. Deeds and the third runner stayed with him. "Is that all you got?" Deeds said, but Kata could hear the strain in his voice. Kata coasted for 200 meters and then attacked again for 15 seconds. He glanced over. Deeds was starting to slap the ground with his feet. At the base of the hill, they passed the 24-kilometer mark. Smart dropped back. Deeds was still on Kata's tail, but breathing hard. Kata picked up the pace once more, drilling down to just under 3 minutes per kilometer. They were passing a river of runners, and some held out their hands to congratulate him. Kata high-fived one or two just to pretend that he was feeling no pain. As the grade of the slope increased, Kata employed the trick that he'd been taught while training in the red hills of Zantoroland. Want to shatter your opponent's confidence? Just when he starts to hurt, you sing. And so that opens the novel, and I felt that, it's not really a sports or a marathoning novel, but Kata is a marathoner, and it seemed like the perfect sort of job or pursuit to give him, to be a runner, to run in his childhood for glory, and then when he becomes a refugee, to run for his life, to run for food and shelter money, and to run to save the life of his sister, who's in desperate difficulties. So he's really running to stay alive, and his Olympic dreams have had to be entirely shelved. It seemed like a perfect sort of job for a refugee to have. And I wanted the reader to understand really why he'd fled. I wanted to give a face to his suffering, a concrete reason for him to have left Zantoroland. Often we find such diminishing and disrespectful ways to refer to refugees. We might call them economic migrants as if they didn't have serious problems, or we might suggest they're threats to our security. But I wanted to show a refugee, like so many others, like millions of others, who's in grave difficulty. I wanted the reader to feel that difficulty. So after the initial bit of the race that you just heard about, we go back to his childhood and we follow him through a few chapters in his childhood where troubles are brewing and about to explode in Zantoroland. And although the current section of the novel is set in 2018 in Freedom State, this particular bit is set a year earlier. It's 2017. Keita's 23, and he's already an elite athlete, and he's living with his father, who's a widower, whose name is Yo-Yo. Yo-Yo is a world-famous journalist. He lives very modestly, we might say in poverty in Canada, but he's okay, and he's living modestly in Zantoroland. He's published in magazines and newspapers all over the world, and Yo-Yo is actually a minor character in my first novel, Some Great Thing, and in my second novel, Any Known Blood, and I've always thought that I'd like to write a novel about Yo-Yo, and never could quite find my way clear to do so. So in this novel, well, it's about Yo-Yo's son, Keita, but Yo-Yo appears. So here they are together, Yo-Yo and his son Keita, in their home in Zantoroland in 2017. One day, Keita was frying eggs and heating beans for dinner, while his father sat in the armchair and read the New York Times, when someone pounded on the front door. Yo-Yo stashed his newspaper under his chair, while Keita answered the door. 3 government officials in suits and ties stood on the porch. The closest one to Keita said, "Stand at attention for His Excellency, President for Life of the Republic of Zantoroland." A tall man in African-style robe stepped up from behind them. The white cloth of the robe was of the highest quality cotton, bordered with intricate blue stitching. Lots of people came to the door to pay homage to his father, but it took effort not to stare at the president and show all the hatred that he felt. As far as Keita was concerned, the president was responsible for his mother's death, his father's torture, and the deaths and disappearances of countless others, leaving his victims naked and dead in public places. Keita had been taught at home and in school not to hate, only to forgive. But looking at the president now, he felt no forgiveness. "No woman in the house to greet me?" the president said. He gave a booming laugh. One of his aides murmured that Yo-Yo was a widower. "Well," the president said, "every father needs a faithful son to cook for him." The president entered and approached the stove. Because of the unreliable electricity, the alley home had a small 2-burner stove hooked up to 2 propane gas tanks. When one tank ran out, the other could be activated. "Quaint and lovely, just like the ways of people up in the hills," the president said. Keita and Yo-Yo stood at a respectful distance. They knew to be silent unless they were asked a direct question. "Eggs and beans," the president said. "Would Your Excellency like some?" Keita said. Speaking out of turn, without explicit invitation from the president, was the only way he knew to convey his contempt. "I would accept eggs and beans another time," the president said, "but as they are ready now, please go ahead and eat. Yes, serve your father, son, and yourself. Be at ease." Keita removed 2 fried eggs and placed them with beans on his father's plate. His father slid into his chair at the table, his look saying, "Do not speak again unless you're asked a direct question." Keita served himself, brought 2 mugs of water to the table, and sat with his father. The president's 3 aides stood silently at the door, each with his left hand hanging down and his right pulling back a suit jacket and resting on a hip, exposing a revolver. "So, Mr. Ali, renowned journalist of Zantoroland, how are your eggs this evening?" "They are almost as excellent as you," Yo-Yo said. Keita admired his father's answer. One was required to use the term "Your Excellency" in each phrase uttered to Jenkins Randall. This way Yo-Yo came close without quite satisfying the president's requirements. "You must be proud of your son." The president stood behind Keita and rubbed the back of his head. Keita felt the big palm moving slowly, methodically. The president's square ring scratched his scalp. "Yes, I am, Your Excellency," Yo-Yo said. He took in the sight of the president with his son's head in his hands and said, "To what do we owe the honor of a visit from Your Excellency? A father who's such a famous intellectual, with a son who is ranked, what now, in the national marathon rankings?" Fifth, Kata said. The president removed his hand from Kata's head and placed it on his shoulder. Fifth. That's correct, Kata said. Not easy, the president said, in a country known for its runners. Yo-Yo glared at Kata, who kept his mouth shut this time. Kata didn't want to show any respect where it was not deserved, but neither did he want to do something to cause his father harm. The president began walking back and forth between Kata and Yo-Yo, clapping his hands once each time he paused behind Kata. Don't you agree that your father will be pleased to have a long and peaceful retirement and to see his son move up in the national marathon rankings? Yes, Your Excellency, Kata said. He remembered what had happened in the last Olympic Games, when not one of the three Zantorollander marathoners made it onto the medal podium. It had shocked the nation because on a good day, any one of them could have won the race handily. When they returned to Zantoroland, all three marathoners were imprisoned. 2 weeks later, when they were released, each used a red cane and walked with a permanent limp. And you, Mr. Ali, have had quite the illustrious career. The New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Le Monde. I've slowed down in recent years, Your Excellency. Slowing down is a good thing, Mr. Ali. Gives you time to enjoy life, to enjoy your children. Most thoroughly, Your Excellency, Yo-Yo answered. The president, a tall man with the girth of a boulder, stooped to speak in Yo-Yo's ear. Do you follow boxing? A little, Your Excellency. Would you agree that it pains the soul to see the boxer come out of retirement and enter the ring again? I never like to see anyone hurt, Your Excellency. Precisely my thoughts. The wise boxer knows when to fight and when it's time to quit. It's all about balance and what seems right, Your Excellency. I have just the proposition for you, Mr. Ali, the president said. You are the perfect person to write my authorized biography and to place it with publishers around the world. I'll give that careful thought, Your Excellency, Yo-Yo said. This project could bring great pride to the people of Zantoroland. You'll be richly compensated. Due consideration, Your Excellency. The president stood still behind Kata. He let a moment pass. Consider the comforts of a bigger home, a cook, an endless supply of good food for your family. It's well understood that journalists nearly take vows of poverty. How could a widower with children resist the miracle of the fishes and the loaves? There are the fishes and the loaves to consider, Your Excellency, Yo-Yo said. But there's also the eye of the needle. The president stood absolutely still. Kata could hear him swallow. Well, in my humble role as servant to the people of Zantoroland, I'll not endeavor to rush you to your good senses. Enjoy your eggs, Mr. Ali. And Mr. Ali Jr., I wish you fleet feet and a minimum of cardiovascular suffering. I'm sure that no father wishes to see his son in pain. The president left with his aides. So, we're coming close in that scene to the end of Kata's time in Zantoroland, and then he leaves. And you can find out later if you choose to look at the book. But we're back in Freedom State, where the novel begins, and I thought it would be kind of interesting and exciting for the reader, and it would add sort of dimensionality to the protagonist to have a number of vivid secondary characters in this book, some of them taking turns telling the story. So it's Kata's story. He's definitely the leading character, but there are several people competing for space and time, but all in relation to how they want him. And I tried to imagine a novel where every secondary character only exists for one purpose, to get a piece of the protagonist. Maybe to arrest him and deport him, maybe to extort money from him or to exploit him financially, perhaps to sleep with him, perhaps to write a newspaper article about him and advance their own career by writing about him. Everybody wants a piece of Kata, and all the characters who take turns telling the story are expressing the piece that they want. And so it was an interesting way to construct a novel. Also, it helped me resolve a challenge because Kata is I think he's a noble guy, but he's a quiet person. He's not got a lot of flash or color, and I wanted him to be quiet and not necessarily flashy or super colorful. So in order to keep the novel moving and to keep it interesting and to round out his character, if he's not going to be very flashy, we need a lot of flashy, colorful secondary characters to sort of add some sort of jazz to the story. And so a lot of these characters take turns and relating to him. And in this story, one of the characters who's central, the first time I've written a character who vaguely resembles the personality of my own mother, is an 85-year-old woman named Ivernia Beach, who's white, who's obviously retired. She's a widow. She lives alone. She's in a mess of difficulties, and her difficulties intersect with Kata's. So this 85-year-old woman and this 24-year-old man form this intricate and difficult friendship. And this is the first time that Ivernia Beach meets Kata Ali in 2018 in Freedom State. Ivernia drew a long breath. Some 20 years ago, when she was in her 60s and still had nimble fingers, she had taken up the classical guitar. If you played an instrument, something new, something you'd never touched before, it was said to prevent your brain from rotting. The guitar instructor introduced her to the music of Fernando Sor and encouraged Ivernia to breathe while she played. She told him that she'd come to study music, not yoga. She had to abandon the instrument after it gave her tennis elbow. And now, as she ran once more through the events leading up to the accident, she exhaled slowly, just as a guitar teacher had taught her, and replayed in her mind the single moment of kindness and light in an otherwise all-around shitty day. Ivernia had been driving south on Aberdeen Road. She'd already passed Main Street and Queen Street. Now she was entering the thick of the village, the attractive section of Clarkson lined with cafes, shops, beauty salons, and bookstores. 5 blocks ahead were the Parliament building on the left and the Freedom building with offices for federal politicians on the right. Beyond them was a giant Ruddings Park. Beyond that, the railway tracks, the former end of the city. And after 5 kilometers of no man's land, the sudden mushrooming of Africtown. But Ivernia wasn't going anywhere near that far. The Lox and Bagel was located right here, in the heart of the village, and all Ivernia had to do was find a parking spot. She was driving her late husband's 1999 Oldsmobile Intrigue. It was 19 years old, and not a speck of rust. Oversized, like a car fueled with steroids. But it worked like a charm. Southbound traffic kept Ivernia to 20 kilometers an hour. It was a warm spring day. She had the windows down. Above the sound of traffic, she heard a man singing. Good voice. He had a lilting foreign accent, and he was singing a country song. She glanced to her left. Nothing. To her right. There he was. A young black man was running as fast as her car. What a joy it must be, Ivernia thought, to move one's body with that ease and speed. Like Ivernia, he was heading south on Aberdeen. She wondered why he was in the road, but then noticed that pedestrians clogged the sidewalk. He was in his mid-20s, as thin as a pencil. Strapped to his waistband was an iPod, and from it white wires ran up to the buds in his ears. Clearly, he had no idea how loud he was singing the country hit that had become as familiar as the national anthem. I've been running for you, baby. Running all the time. But you're running for another heart, and the heart you want ain't mine. Ivernia had turned off the radio 20 times in the last year just to avoid hearing another note of that song. But it sounded funny and somehow touching coming from this strange runner. Traffic slowed. He ran by her door. His head was bobbing to the music, and yet his eyes were wide open. He caught her looking at him and smiled. She smiled too, and then she pulled ahead of him as the lane before her opened up. It was odd that a man moving that fast could sing as he ran. She left them behind as she accelerated. Traffic moved quickly, and Ivernia caught 2 green lights. There, up ahead just 1 block, was the Lox and Bagel. Parking on Aberdeen was murder. But just ahead of her, directly in front of the Lox and Bagel, a car pulled out. Ivernia slowed down. A space big enough for her Oldsmobile. No fire hydrant. No reason she couldn't park there. She detested parallel parking, but there was no option. She pulled up beside a Jaguar, put the Olds into reverse, and checked the rearview mirror. Lots of pedestrian traffic on the sidewalk, but there was nothing between her and the BMW parked behind. She backed halfway in, turning the wheel clockwise to ease into the spot, and then counterclockwise to straighten it out. She stopped midway to make sure she was fine. The Olds was such a big car. Everything looked okay, and then it happened. She was about to press down on the accelerator ever so gently to continue reversing when a baby cried, loudly. She meant to jam her foot on the brake, but instead mashed it down on the accelerator. The Olds shot back, and the next instant, Ivernia felt metal crumple and heard glass shatter. A woman began screaming. Ivernia couldn't see the woman or the baby. Had she hit them? She flipped the car into drive, pushed on the accelerator pedal again, and charged forward, catching and demolishing the back left end of the Jaguar. She put her car in park and turned off the ignition, then opened the door to more screaming. Ivernia got out of the car. A woman on the sidewalk stood next to a stroller. The baby was in her arms. "Did I hit you?" Ivernia asked. "My car!" "Are you hurt?" Ivernia said. "No, but almost. I was this close," the woman said, holding her thumb and index finger apart, "when you smashed into my car. And here I was with my baby." The singing runner showed up. "Hello, ma'am," he said to the young mother. "May I help?" She looked grateful. The runner lifted the stroller back to the far side of the sidewalk. The woman had dropped a bag of groceries. He retrieved cans and bags, bending and straightening until he'd stored them all in the stroller. The runner then saw Ivernia, looked straight at her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "Yes, quite." But she wasn't all right, and he could see it in her eyes. "Why don't you sit down?" he said. There was a bench at the edge of the sidewalk in front of the Lox and Bagel. He led her to it, resting his fingertips on her shoulder. She tried to remember the last time that anybody had touched any part of her body in a kind, solicitous way. "Everything's going to be okay," he said. "Nobody's hurt, right?" She nodded. He straightened, went to the car door, pulled out her purse and car keys, and returned with them. "Sit here. You'll need your things. Are you okay, ma'am? Breathe a little." Ivernia stared at him with glassy eyes. The earbuds were strung over his shoulder. From them, she detected the tinny sound of country music. "I heard you singing back there," she said. He smiled. "I sing when I train," he said. She heard a siren. She looked up and saw a police vehicle 2 blocks away. He said, "God bless, must run, take care. Don't worry, everything will be okay." Once more he touched her shoulder. Ivernia felt the calm spread through her body. Nobody was hurt. What was the worst that could happen? "Wait," she said. "What's your name?" He hesitated, smiled once more, and said, "Roger Bannister." "Goodbye and good luck." He set off running again, southbound on Aberdeen in the direction of Reddings Park and Africtown. "Roger Bannister," she mumbled to herself. She knew that name. The British runner, the first one to break the 4-minute mile. He did it on May 6, 1954, 64 years ago. She remembered. She was 21 years old, and it was a day that she and Ernie married. She wished she'd had time to tell that to the runner. A hand was on her shoulder, a firm hand. Ma'am, were you involved in that accident? Are you the owner of the Oldsmobile? She looked into the eyes of a square-jawed police officer, whose expression seemed to say, "You've gone and ruined my perfectly good day." Perhaps Ivernia should have waited for a lawyer, or fought the charge, or sought to plea bargain. She knew all about those things, but she was an old woman, and she had no mind for subtleties. So she just looked at him and said, "It all comes down to one thing, officer. I screwed up. So can we get on with it?" It was a day later now, and her license was suspended, her car impounded, and she was feeling suffocated in the meeting room of the Office for Independent Living. She was bursting with impatience. She wanted out. Whatever they were going to do to her, she wanted it to be over. So here she was telling her three inquisitors one more time that she realized the gravity of the situation but did not want a lawyer. "Could we just get this done?" she asked, keeping her hands under the table so the three inquisitors could not see them shaking. When you reached the age of 85, hands were simply not to be trusted. Ivernia tried to calm herself by thinking of the gentle face of the runner. The one had stopped to help everybody, herself included. The runner was the only person who'd said a kind word to her that entire day. Ivernia hoped the runner was not a refugee, or if he was, that his life had not been too hard and that he would not be caught and deported. She focused on her breathing and on good thoughts. Fernando Sor, the runner singing country music, marrying her husband on the same day that Roger Bannister ran the Miracle Mile in 3 minutes and 59 seconds. Ernie had been good to her from their first day together to their last. Breathe, Ivernia, breathe. Keep breathing, and just answer their stupid questions. So there you go. Thank you. I was on stage this summer in a place where I live with my wife and children in the summer in Woody Point in Grossmore National Park in western Newfoundland. It's a great place to write and a great community too, village of 200 people, perfect place to write. And every summer it has a literary festival called Writers at Woody Point, at which I've appeared a couple times over the years. And although it's a village of 200 people, hundreds of people descend on Woody Point for this festival. So the population goes from being 200 to about 1,000 overnight. And it's a great festival. And this summer I had the honor of interviewing the legendary singer-songwriter, folk singer Bruce Cockburn on stage for an hour. He'd performed a couple shows for the previous 2 nights, and then on the third night I interviewed him on stage for an hour. It was a really fascinating time. But I hadn't seen Bruce perform since the 1970s, actually. And he's an incredible musician. But I noticed that when he plays, he says nothing between songs. He doesn't give the audience anything. He puts it all into his songs. And he just figures his songs are the best way to represent himself. And he's not bothering himself with pitter-patter or chatter, in between the songs. And he just doesn't pander in any way to the audience. He let the songs speak for themselves. And I don't quite take that approach. I think that listeners and readers like to hear something of the novel, so I was glad to share that, but also something of the impressions and the ways that the writer came to their work. And I first started to envisage this story, a story about a stateless person. Well, 2 things happened to get me sort of to plant that seed that germinated for decades. One was, I grew up in this sleepy kind of middle-class suburb of Toronto called Don Mills in the 1960s. And in 73, when I was 16, I got my first summer job. And my job was to work for the Ontario Welcome House, which was really an agency of the Ontario government, funded by the Ontario government, to facilitate the entry of immigrants into life in Canada. So I went every day to the Toronto airport. It wasn't even called Pearson back then in 73. And every day my job was to meet immigrants, landed immigrants, who were arriving with their papers at Pearson, and help them find their luggage, find their way up the escalator so they wouldn't, if somebody had never seen the escalator so they wouldn't fall back and hit their head or something. Help them find accommodation, because many people, even landed immigrants, were arriving with no sense of where they'd spend their first night. So I had a string of about 30 hotels, some of which were pricey, but most of which were very modestly priced. And so I tried to suss out, the situation they had if they didn't have somebody picking them up. Talk to them about options and help them find a place to stay, usually with their families for a week or so until they could figure out something better. And also show them about where to look for work and this thing we had back then called Canada Manpower Centers, talked to them about that, and that was my job. It was a fascinating job for a kid from the suburbs to meet immigrants every day at Pearson Airport. It was 1973, which was 1 year after 1972, and we all know what happened in 1972. In 1972, one of the most brutal dictators to ever walk the planet, named Idi Amin, expelled Ugandan Asians from Uganda. Thousands were forced to leave. Currency controls, basically leave or die. And so thousands of Ugandan Asians who formed the business class of Uganda were forced to leave. And thousands came to Canada. They didn't all come by the same direct route. They didn't all come directly. I started working at the airport a year after the expulsion, but they were still coming into Pearson Airport daily the summer I worked at Pearson Airport, and it was a sight to see. A kid from the suburbs, 16, watching refugees from Uganda arriving daily and waiting for hours and hours and hours to be processed. But processed they were, and in they came, and we have a spotted history in terms of welcoming or not welcoming people. At times we've been absolutely merciless. We turned away a ship of refugees trying to flee the Holocaust and sent them back to their death in Germany. We've turned away ships carrying British refugees on the Kamagatu Maru and turned them away in Vancouver and wouldn't allow them to stay and sent them back to India. They were British subjects, but they weren't considered by the Canadian government to be British because they were also Indian. So they were sent back, and some of them died when they arrived at the harbor back in India. So we've had moments where we've been incredibly cruel and heartless to refugees, but we've also shown occasionally real heart. And we reached out to the Ugandan Asians and we expedited their arrival into Canada, and they blended into this country by the thousands. We also reached out to Vietnamese refugees, and of course there was all sorts of talk at the time that we'd be infiltrated by the communists and what was to become of Canada. But Vietnamese refugees coming to Canada as so-called boat people integrated profoundly and with great elan, into our country, and have given us a great deal. Another example of fabulous generosity was to reach out to the people of Kosovo after one of the most brutal wars, civil wars the 20th century has ever seen, the war in the former Yugoslavia, and we brought over people from Kosovo. And I can't help but believe that if refugees now fleeing various troublesome spots in Africa and in Syria were coming from France or the UK or Australia, we would have flung our doors open and welcomed people by the thousands much more quickly and much more generously than we've done to date. I think we're dragging our heels, and I believe we could do much, much more. I'm not an expert in this area. I'm not an immigration or a refugee expert. I'm an ordinary Canadian who's a novelist who likes to read the newspapers and magazines and who feels it's his civic duty to follow what's going on in the world. So I come to you not as an expert on these issues, but as an engaged citizen and as a novelist. I feel that, this country was built by people, many of whom came with nothing, whether they came as refugees or immigrants. We seem to have an attitude that we need the wealthy, we need the privileged, or we need professionals. Of course, we need people with great skills and professions. Clearly, we need that. But we also, I think, need to recognize the drive and the motivation, the determination, the chutzpah, that accompanies people who are desperate to set up in this country and get going. And I don't think it's a matter of pure altruism. Of course, we have to have some altruism to orient ourselves and our governments to receive people more openly. But if we do open our doors and do what we can in this troubled world, maybe not solving every problem, but doing what we can more vigorously, we will, I believe, benefit profoundly. And all the skills and aspirations and drives and motivations of people who are desperate to get here and set up and get their lives going will help us continue to build our country and move forward. So we're not talking pure altruism here. There's much to be gained and benefited from also, just as we have over the history of Canada. So we have sent visa officials into the field in the past to process applications so people could get here more quickly. One of the saddest things about refugees, say, trying to get out of Syria is that even if you qualify, I hear this over and over again reading reports in newspapers, it can take years to get somebody here. And that's a sin and a tragedy. And so I think we need to do what we can, sending visa officials into the field and working with NGOs to bring people over more quickly so they don't languish and die after they've been accredited and judged, able to get to this country. So I'm going to be looking for ways to encourage Canadians to bring more refugees here and to assist those refugees, in my writing, but also in my actions. And I think we're facing really one of the gravest humanitarian crises the world has seen since the end of the Second World War. And we have our own consciences to consider, as well as the welfare of the world and the state of our own country. So I'm hoping that whomever's leading our country after October 19th, shows heart and compassion and drive and intelligence and summons the very generosity that we have repeatedly shown in the past, and summons that again to facilitate the arrival of many more refugees than we've allowed to come to Canada since the Syrian civil war began. I suppose if you want to learn about refugee issues, if I want to learn about refugee issues, read a good article in a newspaper, read magazines, read reports by organizations that are involved in these issues, or read what refugee and immigration advocates and lawyers are saying about it. But I had to ask myself when I was writing this novel, what do I have to add to this issue? I'm a novelist. People don't go to novels for facts for the most part, nor should they. I mean, a novel can lead you to want to learn more facts about something, but reading a novel is not sort of the place you naturally start if you're on a fact-finding expedition. So what can a novelist do? What's the role of an artist in this world, and particularly with regard to this crisis? Well, I think we look to narrative to tell ourselves who we are, who we want to be, and what our values are. Everybody has a story. When you meet a stranger in Vienna, in a cafe, or in a hotel, or in a train, or an airplane, and you actually get to talking and telling something, you have a story. You have a story about yourself. You spin a narrative that tells a stranger who you are, and that's a story you might have told 30 or 100 times in your life, or more. We have stories, and we look to stories. Look at children, how they absorb stories with such thirst and hunger, and they die to be read to and love to be read to. Children and others, adults, look to story to motivate and to inspire and to understand who we are. Just as places of worship become places of meditation and understanding, literature and art also allows us to go into ourselves and understand ourselves. And I believe that if I can make a contribution as a novelist, in this case with The Illegal, it's to open up the hearts of readers and to help readers understand and imagine and visualize that refugee trying to get through Hungary on the way to Germany could be us, or could be our children, or could be somebody that we love and know, and probably has the very same aspirations that we have, to live in peace and to live well and to build a life, perhaps a family, to use their skills and to move forward in life. And to be peaceful. Most people in this world want to be peaceful and want to benefit from all that peace leads and offers. And so that's what I'm hoping the novel does, to open up the reader to what the life of a refugee might look like. And so I wanted to write about this marathoner who flees, and it seemed like the perfect job for a refugee, to be a runner and to be running for glory in his childhood and then running for survival once he's hiding in a nation where he's not wanted. I also thought it would be interesting to saddle this refugee, this elite runner, with some medical issues. Why not? I mean, refugees that we see, thousands and thousands or millions on the run, maybe they're pregnant and don't have somebody to assist them in the late phase of a pregnancy. Maybe they have some blood disorder. Maybe they have a terrible infection or a disease or an illness. These are people with the same sorts of problems that we all have. And so I thought, what better way to illustrate Keita's humanity than to saddle him with a few medical problems that can't really get tended to until his situation is regularized. I started thinking about the notion of statelessness in addition to the first spark working at the airport when I was 16. In the 1980s, I started going to Berlin, West Berlin, as it was then called, to visit my late sister Karen Hill, who lived in Berlin for about a decade, up to a year or so before the wall came down. And Karen was this young woman, from this mixed race, black and white family, and she was looking to affirm her racial roots and sort of find a sense of racial identity, something that she'd struggled to find in Don Mills, Ontario, growing up in the 60s and 70s. So she went to Berlin. I went off to work a few times as a volunteer in various African countries. Karen went to Germany, and she started to integrate with the Afro-German community in Berlin in the 80s. And as I started to visit Karen in Berlin, I started to meet many of the Afro-Germans that she was frequenting, and I got to know that man that she fell in love with, and with whom she had a child, who's now my 26-year-old niece, Malika, who, by the way, studied at the University of Waterloo and graduated. And this guy that she fell in love with used to be a political cartoonist for a newspaper in Khartoum in Sudan. And when political violence erupted, he found himself on the wrong side as a journalist, as a political caricaturist. He found himself on the wrong side of a coup, so he fled, and he went to East Germany. I don't quite understand all the politics in this, but the way Karen explained it to me, if you were black, say from East Africa, and you could get to East Germany, in the 1980s, the East Germans were happy to let you go through that wall and to keep on moving into West Germany. If you were living in the communist bloc, of course, you'd be shot if you tried to cross through the Berlin Wall. That's what they had the wall for. But they would let East Africans go through that wall to enter West Berlin. But once you got there, you weren't really given any sort of legal footing to get your life going, right to work, right to open a bank account, right to get yourself going. It was really difficult. So all these Sudanese found themselves in Berlin having trouble getting their lives going. And so what Seth did, my sister's partner, since he had this skill of being a newspaper cartoonist, he started offering to draw your caricature on the streets of Berlin. He was one of those caricaturists who's hoping to make 10 or 15 Deutschmark, as they were then called, in exchange for drawing your caricature in 15 bold strokes. And we've all seen, if we've traveled in European capitals, caricaturists in Madrid or Paris or Berlin who are offering to do that very thing. But next time you see one, it's kind of an interesting exercise. What did this person used to do? Where do they used to live, and why are they trying to draw my caricature on the streets of Berlin? And what skills did they used to have? Were they an emergency room surgeon? What were they doing before they're trying to draw my caricature on the streets, and where did they come from? And so watching Seth and all sorts of other basically stateless Sudanese try to get their lives moving with great difficulty in West Berlin, I started to imagine this notion of statelessness. And as I said earlier, millions of people find themselves in this situation, unable to kind of come out of hiding, unable to emerge from under the radar screen and to get their lives going. And if you probed the schools of Waterloo or Toronto or Halifax or Vancouver, you would find many children whose parents are undocumented refugees living amidst us. And we owe it to them, and we owe it to ourselves to allow them to integrate and encourage them to integrate into our society so they can get their lives going and we can benefit from it. So that's a bit about the illegal and some of my thoughts about refugees. I understand that we have a few minutes for questions and answers, and so I'm happy to answer a few questions if you have them or try to reply. And so I'd welcome you to ask or comment if there's something you'd like to say. It's a very quiet group. It wasn't this quiet the last time I came to Waterloo. Nothing right now? Yes?
At the beginning, you had a really interesting narrative film. Was it just an ad for the book, or is that the beginning of a documentary you want to work on?
No, that was produced by CG, and that was this wonderful, the credits, I'm sure, show the wonderful people who are involved, but it was produced by CG, and they just asked me to pull, just to offer a few lines that would go above this kind of this wonderful animation. So it was really just a way to kind of dramatize and illustrate the notions that I'm getting at in the book. It's not part of the publicity of the book or anything like that. It was just sort of done for this evening and done to sort of help promote this event and done to sort of celebrate the notion of refugees trying to get on with their lives and to draw my voice into it. Yes. Yes. Why did I set the novel in the year 2018? Well, in the other books that I've written, there's always been a very concrete socio-historical, political backdrop. Winnipeg, Baltimore, Nova Scotia, Mali, New York, South Carolina. I've always looked to create Oakville, to look to create stories in concrete places and bring out those histories. But in this case, I didn't really feel like writing specifically and solely about Canada. I wanted to write about a world that had really gone to pot and that had embraced the most hateful policies imaginable. We may not be too far from there, but we're not quite at that point yet in terms of the things that are going on in Freedom State in 2018. And I felt the reader would come with me more willingly if I invented two countries, and I drew from some of the practices I've seen around the world, but just created as well, and also fast forward and went ahead a few years. I felt the reader would come with me more willingly into this land that's not quite Canada, but could perhaps be. Some of our most memorable fiction is set in places in weird times in the future or times that aren't quite defined and in strange places. 1984. Alice in Wonderland. Harry Potter, for that matter. People go willingly sometimes, readers, to places that are made up, and sometimes those stories can feel even more universal. I guess I could add the Little Prince to that. So, since I was looking to create a world that didn't quite reflect exactly the political reality of Canada or the States or France, I felt it best to invent worlds and a time. And I felt the reader would come with me and the story would feel more global and more universal as a result.
Okay.
There's a story online, a question online here. Can you comment on why you think stories of migration resonate so strongly with Canadian readers? And that's from John in Kitchener. Well, to state the obvious, Canada is the endpoint of many, many people who've come in a state of migration. Migration defines the Black experience around the world, and that's something I've written about a great deal, as, of course, has James Walker in the audience today. But migration defines the experience of a great many other Canadians, too. And so we are a nation of people who've been migrating, whether recently or in the distant past. And so I think we understand and we're more interested in the world than we might be if not for that background. So the diversity of our own origins, I think, lends us to appreciate stories of migration, and they're dramatic. we all can appreciate, I think, the story of somebody who's thrown into migration, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. It's a very dramatic situation to put a person in when they're swept into the world that they hadn't even anticipated or really wanted to go to, but had to go through to or were taken to. So it's a story that's occurred over and over again in our literatures, and migration is something that has a universal appeal to it. Hello.
Okay, can we have you come down to the 2 microphones for our online audience, please?
Good evening, Mr. Hill. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I work with refugee adolescents in the high school system, those who come like on the boat that you were describing. And we have been working to get them to write some of their life narratives, some of their trauma stories. And they come to these trauma stories very voluntarily, so we're not forcing them to tell their stories. And we've realized that this is part of their way of healing as they tell their story, retell their story, tell it to other individuals, and so forth. So within the context of your novel, I'm wondering, in order to reconcile with some of these very difficult issues that you deal with, do you also engage in a certain sense of healing?
Do I engage in the healing by writing and offering that writing to other people?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean? Well,
Yeah.
I hope so. I totally understand what you're referring to, by the way, and I think that it's well understood and appreciated that art can play a profound role in helping people deal with their trauma and move forward. And several years ago in Hamilton, where I live, I did some volunteer work with an immigrant women's center in Hamilton, and the volunteer work was to go in as a writer and to work with a number of immigrant women who'd chosen, voluntarily to assemble and to hang out, and who wanted to write autobiographically, who wanted to write bits of memoir, even if it's just a page or a chapter. They wanted to write about where they'd come from and how they'd come to Hamilton and what their lives looked like. And this was the whole basis of this kind of volunteer experience, was to encourage people to write, sort of to find their stories and to move through themselves and to just feel better about life and to encounter the beauty of art. And, writing, it doesn't have to be the province of professionals. It's kind of like guitar playing. You don't necessarily have to aspire to perform on stage. You might love to play the guitar, as I do, in private, just for pleasure, just to enjoy the beauty of music without thinking you have to perform or be a professional. And so many people write just as they might play the guitar or paint. They write, for themselves, not necessarily for professional advancement. And I think it's a really beautiful thing to do if a person wants to do it. It can also shake you up, and it can drag you through a lot of trauma. So a person really needs to be aware and kind of warned, about some of the dangers in writing. It can really shake you up if you start to dig into things that are very painful, which you probably will. Otherwise, what's the point of writing? But yes, I do believe that fiction and writing, both reading and writing, helps situate a person. It helps them move through their lives and helps them feel more grounded, more aware, and able to process what they've experienced. It's a beautiful thing. There are many other art forms that can play the same role, painting or singing. So I'm not like provincial about it, thinking it has to be writing and that's better than anything else. But I think that creation is very close to a fundamental human need. And if your housing needs are met and you have food in your belly and you have clothes on your body, I think most people long to create. And you'd be surprised how many adults have come to me at the age of 40 or 50 or 60 and said, with a kind of sadness in their faces, I'd always wanted to write a novel. And they kind of look like they're not going to make it. It's not going to happen. But they wish they had, and they feel this kind of longing because they long to express themselves, and something they see in a mind triggered that sentiment. And if you look at any healthy child who has food and shelter, what are they doing in their spare time? They're singing and dancing and finger painting or scribbling. They are expressing themselves creatively, and we lose touch of that often. And then, of course, one of the challenges of adulthood is to find their way back to the joys of creativity that children are encouraged to feel. Later on, it's like, if you can't make money from it, what's the point? But that's a sad way to think, because creativity, I think, is very close to a human need. And whether it's baking a gorgeous cake, or stitching something together, or sewing, or writing or painting or playing a guitar, all of these things and more are ways that we come to feel beautiful and to connect with beauty in the world. So yes, I do feel that writing, among other things, is a great way to help people connect with their trauma and to move through it.
Thank you for your insights.
Thank you. How are we for time? Two more questions? One or two more questions. I'm going to take your question, and then I'm going to read a question online. But please go ahead, since you're at the mic.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming here, Mr. Hill. I've been working with refugees for the past 7 years, especially right now with privately sponsored refugees. And you very correctly mentioned that it's taking a long time to get the processing done overseas. And myself, I've had a client die overseas while they've been waiting for medical attention. So I just wanted to say thank you, because you basically, in your writing, you've affirmed everything that we as private sponsors go through in helping refugees. And earlier you had said, what can we do? What can I do as an engaged citizen to bring this about? Well, your book has been wonderful in highlighting this. And also, in answer to your question is, if you can advocate on behalf of refugees and refugee sponsors, to expedite these processes, because the government said they were sending these officers abroad, but we're still waiting years. And also to increase international funding, in foreign aid for programming that supports refugees abroad, because we can't bring all the refugees over, but we can support them and provide them with protection right now. So that's it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. There's a question online. I don't quite understand it, actually. I'll read it, but it says, has the story of Aboriginals, has the story of Aboriginals piqued your interest in terms of documenting their history through fiction? Well, that's an interesting question, because the next novel that I'm contracted to write and I'm about to start working on in January has to do with the building of the Alaska Highway. And sorry about that. I don't know even what that was, but it just fell. Maybe I better find out what it was. It's not my cell phone, because anyway, it's somebody else's cell phone, I guess. Does anybody own this cell phone? In 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, there was a great fear that the Japanese would invade America through Alaska and come down, invading, through the northwestern tip of the continent. And thus, the American government decided, after years of dithering, to build the Alaska Highway, connecting northern BC, going through Yukon and going to Alaska. And the idea was to create a supply route that could move munitions and oil up the highway to help American soldiers fight off the invading Japanese. And the Japanese government actually produced propaganda mocking the Americans and saying, thank you for building the highway for us, we'll be right down it. During the war, I kid you not. At any rate, the American government asked the Canadian government if they could build the highway. And the Canadian government said back, screw off. In case you haven't noticed, we're at war, you're not, and we're tied up, so we can't build a highway, but we'll let you build it if you provide your own men to build it. You can pass through our land. So as it turned out, the American government brought up about 10,000 soldiers. My father was a soldier, an African-American soldier in the American Army in the Second World War. He didn't participate in building the highway, but he was a soldier. Brought up 10,000 soldiers to build a highway, of whom 3,000 were black, coming from the deep south, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, building the Alaska Highway. It's a story that is largely unknown to most Canadians, a bit like the Book of Negroes, and very exciting. It involves African Americans, it involves Canadians, it involves, to answer this question, Aboriginal peoples who are in the north, and it involves the intersection of all of these groups and more in the building of this highway, this passing, of course, through Aboriginal lands, on the way to Alaska. So I'll be turning to that in the next novel. Thank you so much. And I believe I'd like to welcome to stage Dr. James Walker from the University of Waterloo, and I'm going to step down. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, it's my very pleasant assignment tonight to express the appreciation to Larry Hill for your interesting, passionate, intimate, inspiring presentation tonight on behalf of Wilfrid Laurier University, University of Waterloo, CG, and I'm quite sure this audience as well. I've been told to come in under 3 minutes, and unless I stick to my text, I won't do so. Carol mentioned that you'd been here 8 times to Laurier, several times at St. Jerome's College, University of Waterloo, elsewhere in Kitchener, and yet every time you can pack a house like this. I know I was told tonight that the tickets all went within 2 hours of becoming available. There's somewhere out there watching us now, there are another 80 people who couldn't get in, several hundred people on a waiting list, plus a webcast. Larry, if I can't express the appreciation adequately in 3 minutes, you're getting lots of appreciation anyway, and I'm sure you realize it, and it's very well deserved. And not just from Waterloo, of course. I know you were in Halifax a week ago, you were in New York last night, you're off after Thanksgiving break, you're off to the west of Canada. So, oh, and by the way, Carol mentioned your Governor General's Award. Little more than a month before that, you got the Order of Canada. So this man's had a lot of appreciation, but we can add to it, I'm sure, when we're done tonight. In your talk tonight, Larry, and in your new book, you demonstrate your talent for putting a human face on an issue of global significance. One we read about every day, the refugee crisis, or I suppose we should say crises, and you bring it home to Canada. I say Canada because you disavowed this in your remarks. You said it might be Canada, but this let me tell you. Your mythical island has a governing party that's unwelcoming to refugees, an unpleasant prime minister, a rascally prime minister's office. Spoiler alert, I suppose. A street called Avenue Road, you mentioned that tonight in your reading, and even a Tim Hortons. I rest my case. Home creeps in even more intimately with characters named Grafton and Hill. For those of you who don't know it, Grafton is a recurring name in the Hill family. A Viola and a Desmond, recalling that great hero of Nova Scotian civil rights, Viola Desmond. You've got a Peters and a place called Clarkson, bringing into your new novel some of the luminaries from the Black Loyalist story from the Book of Negroes, Thomas Peters and John Clarkson. You mentioned tonight that your mother, Donna, was, to some extent, a model for Avernia. And just a month or two ago, she was telling us the story of her auto accident. So there are an awful lot of connections here. And we mustn't overlook the fact that you are yourself a marathon runner, and we can trust the authenticity of the events that carry so much of your narrative. My wife, Stephanie, whose first degree was in English literature, pointed out that the prose has a rhythm of running. I'm afraid I didn't catch that. I'm a civil historian, but presumably she's not the first or only person who noticed that. But actually, Larry is a novelist, and you mentioned what you think your role is, and let me add a line to it. You're not tied to time or place. You create 2 mythical islands, and your story extends into the near future. You can, and you do, take scattered specifics from real life and give them universal meaning. I've said many times that the Book of Negroes offers a greater truth than nonfiction writer, including my own, precisely because you can amalgamate characters and events and mold them into their essentials. You've done this for us tonight, and I'm sure that we better understand the immediate issues, the daily headlines, the triumphs and tragedies, the horrors and the heroism that your fiction illuminates. As they say in Nova Scotia, thanks, bud.
Thank you, Jim, for your remarks. Just a few comments before we adjourn. An edited video of this evening's live webcast will be posted to the CG website within 48 hours. If you'd like to share this evening's lecture with friends or family or through your social media channels. And in the coming weeks, we invite you to join us for 2 more public events here in the CG auditorium. On Thursday, October the 15th, we invite you to join us for CG's Community Art Awards Night, where we'll announce the winners of our art contest, generally sponsored by the KW Community Foundation through the Moosegetties Fund. Shirley Medill, who's the Executive Director for the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery, will discuss art community engagement, the role of art in building a thriving community. This is a one-of-a-kind CG event followed by a wine and cheese celebration where you can meet the local artists and view the winning art pieces that will become part of the CG Permanent Art Collection. Then on Thursday, October the 29th, we welcome CG Distinguished Fellow David Reynolds for his talk on the COP21 Paris Climate Talks, a success dressed up like a failure. That's a question mark. Be sure to register online for the CG Events newsletter to receive information on all of our upcoming events. Thank you for joining us this evening, and have a safe journey home. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation. My name is Colleen Fitzpatrick, and I'm the Community Relations and Events Manager here at CG. I'd like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the CG Signature Lecture Series. You'll find Wordsworth in our lobby after the lecture with Lawrence Hill's new book, The Illegal, for sale. Tonight's special event price for the book is $35, which includes tax. I'd also like to extend our thanks to our co-sponsors this evening, Wilfrid Laurier University and the University of Waterloo. They invite you to a community coffee reception and a book signing following this lecture in our grand foyer. To reduce wait times at the book signing table, we kindly ask that you hold off on photo taking until all the books have been signed. Thanks also to all of you for joining us this evening, whether you're here as part of our live audience or the many joining us through our live webcast this evening. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both audiences at the microphones here at CG or through the live chat function on your screen. Please remember to state your name and to keep your questions brief. Here to introduce tonight's speaker is Carol Duncan, Professor of Religion and Culture at Wilfrid Laurier University. Please join me in welcoming Carol.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to join you this evening in introducing Lawrence Hill, author, screenwriter, someone I'm proud to call friend as well, and somebody who I think exudes loving kindness for other human beings and portrays that in all of his works. I've been a faculty member at Laurier for 18 years, and this is probably my 8th event with Larry over the last 15 or so. We first met 22 years ago in Toronto at York University in an event connected with Larry's very first novel. Since then, I've had the opportunity to work with him on several different projects. With each visit to the Kitchener-Waterloo community, Larry has deepened his friendships and connections with us all, and we are all richer for these visits. He's the author of 10 books, including The Illegal, his latest novel, and the much-celebrated The Book of Negroes, winner of various awards, including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and CBC Radio's Canada Reads. He was the inaugural writer-in-residence at Laurier, holding this position in fall 2010. In fact, The Illegal was something that he was working on at the time, and so here in Waterloo we have that connection to that work as well. In October of that same year, Larry's contributions to literature were recognized with an honorary doctorate of letters at Laurier, and I know that he holds the same distinction at the University of Waterloo as well. He delivered the 2013 Massey Lectures based on his nonfiction book, Blood, The Stuff of Life. He co-wrote the adaptation for the 6-part television miniseries, The Book of Negroes. Most recently, he is the winner of the 2015 Governor General's History Award for Popular Media, known as the Pierre Berton Award. This award recognizes those who have brought Canadian history to a wider audience. Larry's novel and the televised miniseries based on it have brought attention to a previously little-known chapter of Canadian and American history. This year in January, Laurier hosted a memorable community screening of an episode of the miniseries, followed by an in-depth discussion with Larry and with director and co-writer Clement Virgo. His current novel, The Illegal, I won't say lots and lots, I don't want to ruin the surprise or the wonder of reading the work, but it reflects on the past, is very much about the present moment around refugee crisis in the world, and also looks to the future with its setting. Larry's interest in these issues is not recent. He has had decades-long involvement as a volunteer with Crossroads International and with the Black Loyalist Heritage Society and Project Bookmark of Canada. This evening, his lecture is entitled The Illegal, a meditation on refugee issues. Following this evening's lecture, there will be a book signing and reception. Copies of the novel will be available for purchase, as Colleen Fitzpatrick mentioned, through book vendor Wordsworth Books. Without further ado, please help me to welcome Lawrence Hill.
Thank you so much, Carol, for that warm welcome. I have been so many times invited by Carol Duncan and her wonderful colleagues at Wilfrid Laurier University to speak here and to meet students, and it's an honor each time to do so. I must say that the books that have stayed with me my whole life, the books that I remember verbatim, the books that just lifted me into another sphere of awareness, were generally the books that I was reading as a teenager or as a young adult. And when you read a book when you're 15 or 21 and it just shocks you and sends you into another stratosphere of awareness, it's a book that you'll carry with you forever. And so it's a great honor to think that from time to time, university students or younger, high school, junior high, are reading my works and ingesting them and hopefully being moved by them. So thank you so much for welcoming me here. And those thanks go to many people. Colleen Fitzpatrick and CG, thank you so much for hosting this event. Wilfrid Laurier University, including, of course, President Max Blau and Vice President Deb McClatchy, and the University of Waterloo. I so much appreciate all of your partnerships in making this happen today. Also, Wordsworth Books and HarperCollins. You know that writers are not born in vacuums. They don't become writers in a vacuum. You know, it takes a village not just to raise a child, but also to raise a writer. And it's a village of infrastructure, publishers, bookstore owners, universities, grade school teachers, parents, critics. We live in a country that's rich with literary infrastructure, and it's for that reason I think that Canadian writers are so beloved and known and read across this country and around the world. It's a great country to be a writer in, so thank you so much for welcoming me today. And I've had occasion to come to University of Waterloo and to Wilfrid Laurier University and through One Book, One Community and various communities here. So it's great to be back. And as Carol mentioned, I wrote part of The Illegal and also worked on the Book of Negroes in Lucinda House on campus at Wilfrid Laurier, and I'm looking forward to coming back. And I must say that since James Walker, Dr. James Walker is in the audience today, I must say that I could never have written the Book of Negroes. Talk about infrastructure and standing on people's shoulders. Never could have written that novel without the seminal historical research laid down in Jim's book, The Black Loyalist, which came out around 1977-78 for the first time. Still the definitive, most scholarly history documenting the story of the Black Loyalists as they moved from Africa to the 13 colonies and up to New York City during the war, and then over to Nova Scotia and then back to Africa. Jim's work introduced me to this story, which led me to dramatize it in the Book of Negroes. So truly, we all stand on each other's shoulders. So I'm deeply honored that you're here, and thank you so much. In the Book of Negroes, I think what I was looking to do the most was to give a face to a person who might otherwise seem faceless. And one of the tragedies of transatlantic slavery is it tends to hide or obscure the humanity of the people drawn into it. Often a so-called slave is a faceless person in chains, and we don't see their humanity in full dimensionality. And that's what I was really looking to dramatize and to bring to the page in the Book of Negroes. In this new novel, The Illegal, I guess I'm looking to do something similar. I'm looking to bring to life and bring to the page the story, just one story, one of millions. There are millions of stories, and this is only one, of the stateless, undocumented refugee. What might a life look like? What sort of struggles might a person have? How do you get your life going as a stateless or undocumented person hiding in a rich nation that doesn't want you? I am very much interested in the horrible circumstances that lead people to have to flee for their lives and to seek safety and peace in another life in another land. But in this novel, I'm even more interested in what happens to that person's life when he or she arrives in this new rich land. How do you survive when you're not wanted, when you're unwelcome, when you're undocumented and stateless? There are millions of people in the world, millions in Canada and the United States and in all rich democracies of the world who are stateless and living without papers. It's hard enough, we all know, to get on with our own lives when we're registered citizens, to work, to have a home, to build our lives, to perhaps usher children, ours or those of other people, those children we teach, into the world. We all know how hard it is just to get our lives going, but when you're stateless and have no right to be in a place, of course the challenges are monumentally greater, and that's what I'm interested in The Illegal. I'll come back to this in a minute, but I'll just quickly describe the geographical setting of the novel, and then I'll read a few excerpts from it and talk a bit more about refugee issues and how they came to me and how I came to formulate the novel. This is the first time I've chosen to write a novel or any book in a place that's entirely imaginary. Every other one of my 9 books has a very concrete and real socio-historical geographical setting. But this time I decided to imagine a world that doesn't exist, but hopefully, well, not quite so hopefully, that could. I don't really want this world to exist that I'm imagining, but it could. And it looks like we may be going there in many respects. So I came up with 2 countries, and I set this novel in 2 places. One of the poorest nations in the world, which is a tiny mountainous island called Zantoroland in the Indian Ocean, a nation of black people who were formerly enslaved. And although it's an extremely poor country, it has a dubious distinction of producing the world's fastest marathoners. And in any given year, Zantoroland marathoners might win the top 5 places in the Boston Marathon and sweep gold, silver, and bronze in the Olympic Games. So they're dominant. Running and marathoning is in the culture of the country. Kids grow up running and training at altitude, and we all know what kind of advantages that confers on a marathon if you're training and running at altitude from your childhood. Better oxygen processing, so better runners. And it's in the culture of the country. And the one thing that Keita Ali, my protagonist, aspires to do as a child growing up in relative peace in Zantoroland is to become an elite athlete. This is his ticket to fame, to wealth, to being venerated. This is the one thing that a child can aspire to make him rich and famous in this very poor, destitute country of Zantoroland. So Keita Ali aspires as a child to become a great marathoner, a true Olympian, a champion. And all hell breaks loose in this country. Genocide erupts, political violence, and he's no longer able to pursue those dreams. You know, marathoning, shooting for the Olympics, is a peacetime pursuit. You can hardly think about running for Olympic glory if somebody's trying to kill you and your family and your people. Keita has to flee his country, and he goes to the nearest rich nation that he can get to hide in. It's one of the richest nations in the world. It's called Freedom State. It's also in the Indian Ocean, sandwiched between